Hello, my dear friend. I'm Alex, a storyteller of raw emotions, where every tale is real and touches the soul. Before we begin, I invite you to like, comment, share this video with someone special, and subscribe to the Crossroads of Fate channel so you don't miss any story that could change your perspective on life. Stay until the end because this one will surprise you. Thank you for watching this video, and a heartfelt thank you to the channel members whose names are appearing on screen. Your support makes all of this possible. I wish you a beautiful day, and may God bless you and your family. Let's begin. The CEO and the Photograph of the Past, Part 1. Richard Mendoza adjusted his Italian silk tie as he stared at the red numbers on his computer screen. The quarterly losses of the textile company were devastating, and someone had to pay for it. His cold eyes scanned the list of employees who would be laid off that afternoon. One name stood out. Elena Vargas, the overnight cleaning supervisor. The woman had worked for the company for decades, but the numbers didn't lie. Cutbacks were necessary, and Richard had never allowed feelings to interfere with business. His reputation as a ruthless CEO hadn't been built on compassion. Meanwhile, Elena was finishing organizing cleaning supplies in the 15th floor storeroom. Her hard-working hands, calloused by years of effort, arranged each product with the precision of someone who knows their job intimately. At her age, Elena possessed a serene beauty that time had refined, not destroyed. Her large, expressive eyes reflected a mix of wisdom and weariness. That morning, she had received the dreaded call from Human Resources. Mr. Mendoza wanted to see her in his office. Elena knew things hadn't been well at the company lately. Rumors of layoffs circulated through the hallways like ghosts, whispering the fear of being next on the list into every employee's ear. When the time for the meeting came, Elena walked to the executive floor with a firm step but a racing heart. She had never been in the CEO's office before. The elevator seemed to ascend in slow motion, each floor an eternity of nerves and speculation. Richard received her with his characteristic professional coldness. Behind his mahogany desk, he seemed like an unassailable fortress of expensive suits and ruthless decisions. His face, attractive but hardened by years of power, showed not a hint of emotion as he explained the company's financial situation. Ms. Vargas, Richard began without looking up from his documents, I regret to inform you that due to budget cuts, your position has been eliminated. Your last day of work will be Friday. Elena felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. For over 15 years, she had given her best to that company, working night shifts to keep the building spotless. She had sacrificed nights of sleep and weekends with her family, all for a job that was now being taken away without any explanation beyond red numbers. Mr. Mendoza, Elena managed to articulate in a trembling but dignified voice, I understand the company's situation, but I have a family that depends on my salary. My son is in college, and my elderly mother needs expensive medications. Richard finally looked up. For an instant, something in Elena's pleading expression made him hesitate, but he quickly hardened his face. Business was business, and he couldn't afford the luxury of compassion. I'm sorry, but the decision has been made. Human Resources will explain the details of your severance. Elena left the office with shaky legs and a broken heart. In the elevator, the tears she had held back during the meeting finally began to flow. It wasn't just the loss of the job that devastated her, but the coldness with which she had been treated, as if she were just another number on a spreadsheet. That night, Elena arrived at her modest house in the suburbs with the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her home was small but cozy, filled with family photographs and memories of better times. The light yellow painted walls gave her a sense of warmth that contrasted with the cold corporate world she had just left. Her son Miguel, a college student with the bright eyes of someone who still believes in dreams, was waiting for her in the kitchen. When he saw her, he immediately knew something was wrong. Mom, what happened? Elena tried to smile, but her eyes betrayed her. I lost my job, my love. But don't worry, we'll find a way to get by. Miguel hugged his mother, feeling the injustice that had befallen his family. Elena had been an example of dedication and honesty her whole life, working tirelessly to give them the best she could. She didn't deserve to be treated this way. Meanwhile, Richard drove his luxury car towards his mansion in an exclusive neighborhood. The day had been productive. He had cut costs by eliminating 23 positions, including Elena Vargas's. The shareholders would be satisfied with his efficiency, but something was bothering him. He couldn't shake the image of Elena pleading for her job, the desperation in her eyes when she mentioned her family. It was strange. Normally, these types of decisions didn't affect him. He had laid off hundreds of employees throughout his career without losing sleep. That night, Richard found himself awake in his empty king-size bed, staring at the ceiling. His professional success had come at the cost of his personal life. In his late 30s, he had accumulated a considerable fortune, but his house felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The next day, something prompted Richard to make an unusual decision. Instead of sending his assistant with the final termination papers, he decided he would take them to Elena himself. He didn't know exactly why, but he needed to see where she lived, to know a little more about the life of the woman he had so coldly dismissed. The address led him to a neighborhood Richard had never visited. The houses were small but well-maintained, with modest yards and clothes hanging in the back. It was a completely different world from his own, a reminder that a reality existed beyond glass towers and boardrooms. When Richard knocked on Elena's door, he felt strangely nervous. He wasn't used to visiting his employees at their homes. Elena opened the door with a surprised look, clearly not expecting to see her former boss on her doorstep. "Mr. Mendoza," Elena murmured, confused. "What are you doing here?" "I've brought your severance documents," Richard replied, holding out a manila folder. "I wanted to make sure you understood all the details." Elena invited him in, apologizing for the modesty of her home. Richard entered cautiously, feeling as if he were invading unfamiliar territory. The house was small but immaculately clean, decorated with simplicity but with taste. You could feel the love and care Elena had put into every detail. "Would you like some coffee?" Elena offered, maintaining her courtesy despite the circumstances. Richard was about to decline when something on the living room wall made him stop dead in his tracks. His blood ran cold, and he felt as if the world had stopped around him. There, in a slightly faded gold frame, was a photograph that took his breath away. It was the face of a young, beautiful woman with large, expressive eyes that were terribly familiar. But it wasn't just the familiarity that had left him paralyzed, but the absolute and devastating recognition of who that woman was. "Who is she?" Richard asked in a hoarse voice, pointing at the photograph with a trembling hand. Elena followed his gaze, and her face softened with a mix of love and sorrow. "That's my mother, Victoria. She disappeared about 30 years ago." Richard's world reeled. The severance documents fell from his hands as he struggled to remain standing. Victoria Herrera. The name resonated in his mind like an echo from the past, bringing with it memories he had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten they existed. But there was something more, something Elena didn't know, and that Richard was about to discover in the most shocking way possible. The CEO and the photograph of the past. Part 2. Richard clung to the back of the sofa, his knuckles white from the pressure. The photograph of Victoria stared at him from the wall, like a ghost from the past, unearthing memories he had tried to bury for decades. His mind immediately transported him to a very different time in his life, when he was just an ambitious young man from a humble background. Elena watched with concern at Richard's sudden paleness. The powerful CEO she had known in his office seemed to have vanished, replaced by a man who was visibly shaken and vulnerable. "Are you all right, Mr. Mendoza?" Elena asked, approaching cautiously. Richard couldn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph, remembering every detail of the face he had once loved more than his own life. Victoria Herrera had been the most beautiful woman he had ever known, with those same large, expressive eyes he now saw reflected in Elena. "How did your mother disappear?" Richard finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. Elena sat on the edge of the sofa, her own eyes welling up as she recalled those painful days. "I was very young, just 5 years old. One day she just didn't come home from work. My grandmother, who was taking care of us, called the police, but they never found her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air." Richard closed his eyes, feeling as if a dagger were piercing his heart. He knew exactly what had happened to Victoria. "Did she work anywhere specific?" Richard asked, although he already knew the answer. "Yes, she was a secretary at a construction company. Mendoza Enterprises, I think it was called." The familiar name hit Richard like a hammer. Mendoza Enterprises had been his father's company. Esteban Mendoza, a ruthless man who had built an empire on the foundations of corruption and cruelty. Richard had inherited not only the family fortune, but also the darkest secrets of his lineage. Elena, Richard cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his composure. I need to tell you something about your mother. But first, could you please make that coffee? This is going to be a long conversation. As Elena went to the kitchen, Richard was left alone with Victoria's photograph. The memories flooded him like an avalanche. He was 18 when he met Victoria in his father's offices. She was 20. She had just gotten the job as a secretary and was the most beautiful and kind-hearted woman he had ever known. Despite their social class differences, they had fallen deeply in love. Victoria was different from all the superficial women in Richard's social circle. She was intelligent, hardworking, and possessed a natural goodness that lit up every room she entered. Their secret rendezvous at secluded cafes and distant parks became the happiest moments of Richard's life. Elena returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee, noticing that Richard had tears in his eyes as he looked at the photograph. Mr. Mendoza, you knew my mother, didn't you? Richard nodded slowly, taking the cup with trembling hands. I knew her very well, Elena. In fact, I was in love with her. Elena dropped her cup, which shattered on the tiled floor. The hot liquid spread across the room, but neither of them moved to clean it up. You... what? Your mother and I had a relationship for almost a year, Richard continued, his voice heavy with pain. She was the most incredible woman I had ever met. Intelligent, beautiful, compassionate, everything I wasn't. Elena sat down heavily, trying to process this impossible revelation. But then what happened to her? Why did she disappear? Richard got up and began to pace the small room, his agitation evident in every step. My father found out about our relationship. Esteban Mendoza was a terrible man. He built his empire by destroying anyone who got in his way. I don't understand what that has to do with my mother's disappearance. My father considered our relationship a threat to the family's reputation. A secretary from a humble background was not appropriate for the Mendoza heir, so he took steps to ensure Victoria disappeared from my life. Elena stood up abruptly, her face pale with dawning comprehension. You're saying your father had something to do with my mother's disappearance? Richard couldn't hold her gaze. The truth he had carried for so many years was finally coming to light, and it was more devastating than he had imagined. The night before Victoria disappeared, my father called me to his office. He showed me photographs of us together, documents he had falsified to frame her for theft, and he gave me an ultimatum. I would end the relationship immediately, or he would make sure Victoria was arrested and sent to prison. Elena put her hands to her face, tears beginning to stream down. My God, I was young and a coward, Richard continued, his voice cracking. I thought I could protect her by convincing her to leave the city temporarily until I could confront my father. That night, I went to her apartment and told her she needed to leave immediately, that she was in danger, but I couldn't explain why. And she left? Yes, but not where I expected her to. I had given her money to go to another city, to hide until I could sort things out. But now I realize my father must have intercepted her before she could escape. Elena collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. Everything she had believed about her mother's disappearance was crumbling before this devastating revelation. I spent years looking for her, Richard continued, slowly approaching Elena. I hired private detectives, checked hospital records, orphanages, everything I could think of, but I never found a trace of her. My father died years later without ever telling me exactly what he had done. And you just went on with your life. Elena looked up, her eyes blazing with anger through her tears. You inherited your father's company as if nothing had happened. It wasn't that simple. Richard sat on the opposite sofa, keeping his distance but needing to be close. I became everything I hated about my father. Cold, calculating, ruthless in business. It was my way of punishing myself for being too cowardly to protect Victoria. But that didn't bring her back. No, it didn't bring her back. And now, 30 years later, I discovered that the woman I loved had a beautiful daughter who worked for me for years, and I didn't even know it. Elena wiped away her tears, trying to process all this information. How is it possible that you didn't see the resemblance? I have the same eyes as her, the same features. Richard really looked at her for the first time, not as a subordinate employee, but as a person. Elena was right. The resemblance was undeniable once you looked for it. The same expressive eyes, the same delicate facial structure, even the same graceful gestures when she moved. I think I unconsciously avoided looking at you too closely, he admitted. Anything that reminded me of your mother was too painful. So, on some level, maybe you knew who I was. Or maybe fate finally decided it was time for me to face the truth. Elena stood up and walked towards her mother's photograph, gently touching the frame. My whole life I've wondered what happened to her. If she had done something wrong, if she had voluntarily abandoned us, if she had died. Victoria would never have abandoned you voluntarily, Richard approached, standing behind Elena. She talked about you constantly. You were the most important thing in her life. She told me your father had died when you were a baby and that she would do anything to give you a better life. My father died? Elena turned, surprised. My grandmother never talked about him. She just said he had left. Victoria told me it was a construction accident. She was very young when it happened, barely 19. She was raising you alone, which is why she needed that job at my father's company so badly. Elena felt as if she were discovering her entire family for the first time. Her whole life had been spent with unanswered questions, filling the gaps with her imagination. Now finally the pieces were beginning to fit together. What else can you tell me about her? What was she really like? Richard smiled for the first time since he had entered the house, remembering the woman he had loved. She was the kindest person I've ever known. She always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. She had a contagious laugh that could brighten the darkest day, and she loved you more than her own life. That's why I never got married, never started a family. After losing Victoria, I could never love anyone else. I tried relationships, but I always compared them to her. No one could fill the void she left. Elena looked at this man who had coldly laid her off the day before, but who was now completely vulnerable before her. So what do we do with this information now? How do we live knowing the truth? I don't know, Richard admitted honestly, but I know I can't undo the past. I can't bring Victoria back. I can't change the cowardice of my youth. But maybe I can do something for you. I don't want your pity or your charity. It's not pity, Elena. It's responsibility. My family destroyed yours. My cowardice left you without a mother. Allow me to at least try to repair some of the damage we caused. Elena backed away, needing space to think. I need time to process all of this. It's too much. Of course, Richard replied, but before I go, there's something else you need to know. Elena looked at him cautiously, unsure if she could handle any more revelations. Your job is reinstated, and not only that, I want to offer you a position in company administration. Your mother would have wanted you to have all the opportunities that were denied to her. What if I don't want to work for you? What if I can't separate the man who knew my mother from the CEO who fired me so coldly? Richard nodded, completely understanding her conflict. Then I'll help you find another job wherever you want. But Elena, I need you to know that I never stopped looking for your mother, and now that I've found you, I can't just walk away and pretend none of this happened. Elena looked again at Victoria's photograph, as if seeking guidance from the woman she had never truly known. Did my mother ever mention that she was pregnant again? Richard frowned, confused by the question. Pregnant? No, she never mentioned anything about another baby. Why do you ask? Elena walked to a drawer in the kitchen and returned with a small worn box. After she disappeared, my grandmother found this among her things. She opened the box to reveal a small, clearly new and unused baby shoe. Next to it was a handwritten note in Victoria's handwriting, for the little miracle on the way. Richard stood paralyzed, staring at the shoe as if it were a sacred relic. This means my mother was pregnant when she disappeared, Elena confirmed softly. And if your dates are correct, you could be the father. Richard's world collapsed for the second time in an hour. Not only had he lost the love of his life, but he had potentially lost a son he never knew existed. The weight of this revelation hit him like an emotional tsunami. That would mean I have a brother or sister somewhere? Elena continued, carefully observing Richard's reaction. Or that I had one, Richard murmured, the pain evident in his voice. If Victoria was pregnant when my father intercepted her, he didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood the terrible implications. Elena slowly approached Richard, seeing in him not the ruthless CEO, but a man shattered by past decisions. We have to find the truth, Elena said finally. I need to know what really happened to my mother, and you need to know what happened to your possible child. Richard looked up, finding in Elena's eyes the same determination he had seen in Victoria all those years ago. Are you sure? The truth might be more painful than we can imagine. I've lived my whole life with questions. I can no longer live without answers. Richard stood up, feeling for the first time in decades a purpose beyond business and profit. Then we'll search together. I promise you, this time I will not run from the truth. Elena extended her hand towards Richard, a gesture of truce and a new alliance. For my mother and for the brother or sister I never knew. Richard took her hand, feeling in that grip the connection to Victoria he had lost so long ago. For Victoria and for the truth we owe her. As they parted that afternoon, they both knew their lives had changed forever. The ruthless CEO and the laid-off employee were now allies, united by a shared past and a desperate search for answers that had been waiting for decades. But neither Richard nor Elena could imagine the revelations that awaited them, nor how deep the buried secrets of the Mendoza family went. The truth about Victoria and the fate of her second child was about to emerge from the shadows, bringing with it a series of surprises that would change not only their lives, but their complete understanding of who they really were. The CEO and the Photograph of the Past, Part 3. The days following the discovery passed in a whirlwind for Elena and Richard. They had agreed to meet every afternoon at Elena's house to plan their search, transforming the small living room into a makeshift investigation office. The walls were covered with maps, old photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Richard had used all his resources to hire the best private investigators in the country. His fortune, which had once been only a symbol of his business success, now had a real purpose: to find the truth about Victoria and her possible second child. Elena had taken a temporary leave from her new position at the company to dedicate herself completely to the investigation. Miguel, her college son, had enthusiastically joined the search, impressed by the transformation he had seen in his mother, and intrigued by the possibility of discovering more about his family. "Mom, I've never seen you so determined," Miguel had said one morning as they organized old documents from the Mendoza Enterprises company that Richard had managed to recover from the archives. "It's because for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm close to truly knowing my mother," Elena replied, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and sorrow. The first real clue came from an unexpected source. One of the investigators Richard had hired, an older woman named Carmen Delgado, showed up at Elena's house with a triumphant look on her face. "I found something," Carmen announced, placing a thick folder on the dining room table, a hospital record that had been incorrectly filed. Richard and Elena leaned in anxiously over the documents as Carmen explained her discovery. Victoria Herrera was admitted to St. Raphael's Hospital on the night of her disappearance. She arrived unconscious, apparently after a car accident. Elena felt as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. An accident? But how? According to the medical report, she had signs of head trauma and was in a state of shock. But here's the interesting part. Carmen pointed to a specific paragraph in the medical document. She was approximately 6 months pregnant. Richard went pale, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. What happened to the baby? That's the strange part. The records show that Victoria gave birth during her hospital stay, but the baby was registered under a different name and immediately put up for adoption. Elena sat down heavily, tears beginning to flow. "So I have a brother or sister who's alive?" "There's more," Carmen continued, her voice charged with emotion. "Victoria remained in the hospital for 3 weeks in a semi-conscious state. The doctors said she constantly repeated 2 names, Elena and Richard." Richard closed his eyes, imagining Victoria alone and scared in that hospital bed, calling out for the 2 people she loved most in the world. "What happened next?" Elena asked in a trembling voice. "That's the most tragic part," Carmen sighed deeply. "Victoria developed complications after childbirth, an infection they couldn't control. She passed away 3 weeks after giving birth." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena sobbed uncontrollably while Richard wrapped his arms around her, his own tears falling freely for the first time in decades. "My mother is dead," Elena murmured against Richard's shoulder. "After all these years, I finally know she's dead." "I'm so sorry, Elena. If I had been braver, if I had confronted my father from the start." Elena pulled away to look him directly in the eyes. "You were a victim too. Your father was the one who caused all of this." Carmen gave them time to process the information before continuing. "There's something else you need to know. According to the adoption records, the baby was given to a family named Torres, a boy named Gabriel." Richard looked up sharply. "Gabriel Torres? Do you have any more information about him?" Carmen smiled slightly. "I have a current address. Gabriel Torres, an architect, lives right here in the city." Elena and Richard exchanged disbelieving glances. Elena's long-lost brother, Richard's possible son, had been living in the same city all this time. "How do we find him?" Elena asked, wiping away her tears. "That's the easy part." Richard stood up with renewed determination. "We're going to find him right now." The address led them to a middle-class neighborhood, to a modern but cozy house with a well-kept yard. As they approached the front door, Elena felt as if she were walking towards her destiny. A beautiful middle-aged woman opened the door, smiling cordially until she saw the serious expressions on her visitors' faces. "How can I help you?" "Good morning, Mrs. Torres." Richard cleared his throat nervously. "We're looking for Gabriel Torres. We believe we might have some important information about his birth parents." The woman's expression changed immediately, a mixture of surprise and caution. "I'm Patricia Torres, Gabriel's wife. He's always wanted to know about his biological parents, but we could never find any information." Patricia invited them in and called for Gabriel, who appeared moments later. Elena felt as if she were seeing a ghost. Gabriel had the same expressive eyes as she and her mother, the same delicate facial structure, but with masculine features that slightly resembled Richard. Gabriel was an attractive man in his late 20s, tall and lean, with a warm smile that lit up the entire room. His resemblance to Elena was undeniable, and when he smiled, Richard could see an echo of Victoria's smile that he had loved so much. "Did you know my birth parents?" Gabriel asked immediately, his voice filled with a careful hope. Elena stood up slowly, approaching Gabriel as if he were a mirage that could vanish at any moment. "Gabriel, my name is Elena Vargas. I think I'm your older sister." Gabriel stood paralyzed, studying Elena's face with an intensity that suggested he too had immediately noticed the resemblance. "My sister?" Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Our mother's name was Victoria Herrera. She was the most beautiful and kind-hearted woman in the world, and she would have loved you more than her own life." Gabriel came closer to Elena, extending a trembling hand to touch her face, as if he needed to confirm she was real. "My whole life I felt like something was missing, as if a part of me was lost somewhere. And I always felt I had a brother somewhere," Elena replied, taking Gabriel's hands in hers. Richard watched from a distance, moved by the reunion but still unsure of his place in this new family that was forming. Gabriel finally turned to Richard. "And who are you?" "My name is Richard Mendoza. I knew your mother. In fact, I was in love with her." Gabriel studied Richard's face with new intensity. Patricia, who had been watching in silence, came closer to her husband. "Gabriel, don't you think he looks a little like you?" It was true. Now that Gabriel and Richard were close, the subtle resemblances were evident. The jawline, the shape of the hands, a certain expression in the eyes when they concentrated. "Do you think you could be my father?" Gabriel asked directly. Richard approached slowly. "It's possible. Your mother and I had an intimate relationship around the time you were conceived. But regardless of the biology, I want you to know that if I had known about your existence, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." Gabriel nodded, processing all this overwhelming information. "What happened to our mother?" Elena and Richard told him the whole story. The love between Richard and Victoria, the cruel intervention of Richard's father, Victoria's disappearance, and finally the truth about her death in the hospital after giving birth. "Our mother died alone," Gabriel said finally, his voice heavy with grief, not knowing that her 2 children would grow up without knowing her. "But we have each other now." Elena came closer to Gabriel, taking his hand. "And we can honor her memory by getting to know each other and taking care of each other." Patricia, who had been crying silently throughout the conversation, approached Elena. Elena, Gabriel has always talked about feeling like he had a sister somewhere. Even as a child, he used to say he had an older sister who was watching over him from afar. And I always knew my family was incomplete, Elena replied, hugging Patricia. Thank you for taking such good care of my brother. The following days were of incredible emotional intensity. Gabriel and Elena spent hours talking, sharing their life stories, discovering the similarities in their personalities and values that they had inherited from Victoria. Richard, meanwhile, struggled with his role in this new family configuration. It was evident that Gabriel was his biological son. A later paternity test would confirm it, but he had missed all the crucial years of his son's life. How can I be your father now? Richard asked Gabriel during one of their private conversations. I missed your childhood, your adolescence, all the important moments. Gabriel thought carefully before responding. You can't get those years back, that's true, but you can be present for all the years to come. I'm going to marry Patricia next year. Maybe we'll have kids someday. You could be the great— She's here, Elena replied, discreetly pointing to where a ray of sun filtered through the church windows, illuminating the exact spot where Gabriel and Patricia were standing. I can feel her presence. During the reception toast, Richard stood up to give a speech he had been practicing for weeks. A little over a year ago, I was a lost, empty man who had spent decades running from his past and the truth. I thought business success could fill the void in my heart, but I was wrong. He looked towards Elena, Gabriel, and the framed photograph of Victoria they had placed on the honor table. Victoria Herrera taught me what true love was, even if it was only for a brief time. Elena taught me what strength and dignity mean in the face of adversity. Gabriel taught me that it's never too late to be the man I was always meant to be. His voice cracked slightly as he continued. I can't get back the lost years. I can't change the cowardly decisions of my youth. But I can honor Victoria's memory by being the best father, grandfather, and boss I can be from now on. The applause was deafening, but Richard only had eyes for his new family. Elena, who was crying with pride. Gabriel, who smiled with the same warm smile as Victoria. Miguel, who had found a mentor and father figure in Richard, and Patricia, who had accepted him into the family without reservations. 6 months after the wedding, Elena received news that filled the entire family with joy. Gabriel and Patricia were expecting their first child. He'll be Victoria's first grandchild, Elena told Richard as they planned the baby shower. And he'll be raised with all the love Victoria would have wanted her children to have. And I'll be there to give him all the love I wasn't able to give his father, Richard replied, already imagining himself in his role as a proud grandfather. Richard's transformation had been complete. The company had implemented all the programs he had promised, becoming a model of corporate responsibility. Elena had been promoted to Director of Human Resources, using her personal experience to create a more humane and compassionate work environment. But the most significant changes were personal. Richard had sold his lonely mansion and bought a smaller, warmer house near Elena and Gabriel, to be close to his family. His home, once empty and cold, was now filled with family photographs, children's laughter, and the love that had been absent for so long. On the first anniversary of their reunion, Elena, Gabriel, and Richard visited Victoria's grave together for the first time. They had found where she was buried in a modest section of the cemetery under a simple tombstone that just said, Victoria Herrera, beloved mother. Hi, Mom, Elena spoke softly, kneeling beside the grave. We brought someone special. Gabriel knelt beside Elena, placing fresh flowers on the grave. I'm Gabriel, your son. I'm so sorry I never got to know you, but Elena has told me everything about you. I know you would have loved me, and I want you to know that I love you too. Richard stood behind them, struggling to find the right words. Victoria, he began finally, his voice broken with emotion. I am so sorry I failed you. I am so sorry I wasn't brave enough to protect you. But I want you to know that your love changed me forever, and your children are the most incredible people I have ever met. Elena is strong, compassionate, and wise, just like you. Gabriel is kind, talented, and has your same smile. I love them both more than my own life, and I promise you that I will care for and protect them for the rest of my life. A gentle breeze blew at that moment, rustling the leaves of the tree that shaded the grave, as if Victoria had heard and approved of their words. As they walked away from the cemetery that afternoon, Elena took Gabriel's and Richard's hands. "We're finally a complete family," Elena said with a smile that radiated peace and happiness. "A family Victoria created with her love," Gabriel added, squeezing the hands of his loved ones. "A family we will honor every day of our lives," Richard concluded, finally feeling at home after so many years of searching. 2 years later, in the backyard of Elena's house, a new tradition had been born. Every Sunday, the extended family gathered for an outdoor lunch. Elena cooked Victoria's favorite recipes that she had learned from her grandmother. Gabriel brought his young son, a beautiful baby boy named Victor, in honor of the grandmother he never met. And Richard delighted in his role as a devoted grandfather. Miguel had finished his college studies with honors and had started working at Gabriel's architecture firm, continuing the family legacy of building, but this time, building homes instead of destroying families. "You know what I think, Richard?" Elena said to him as they watched Gabriel teach Miguel how to design architectural plans while little Victor crawled around the yard. "What do you think?" "I think my mother knew exactly what she was doing when she sent me to work at your company. She knew we would eventually find each other, and that her death had not been in vain if we could find each other and form the family she had always wanted us to have." Richard looked up at the sky, where the sun filtered through the clouds in a way that reminded him exactly of the light he had seen in the church on Gabriel's wedding day. "You're right," he said finally. "Victoria brought us together, and now we have the chance to live the life full of love that she would have wanted for all of us." Elena smiled, feeling a deep peace that had been absent her entire life. She had started as a desperate woman looking for food in the trash. She had been unjustly laid off by a cruel boss, but she had found something much more valuable than any job. She had found her family, had discovered the truth about her mother, and had helped heal the broken heart of a man who had spent decades punishing himself for not being brave enough to protect the love of his life. The photograph of Victoria now presided not only over Elena's dining room, but also over Gabriel's and Richard's homes. In each home, it had become a daily reminder that true love never dies, and that families can find each other even after decades of separation. And as the sun set over the city, where a young secretary had once mysteriously disappeared, her legacy lived on in the hearts and lives of the 3 people she had loved most: the daughter she had raised with so much sacrifice, the son she had never met but had loved from before he was born, and the man who had been fortunate enough to be loved by her, even if it had only been for a brief and beautiful moment in time. Victoria's love had triumphed in the end, uniting her family across time, loss, and pain, proving that some things are stronger than death, more powerful than separation, and more lasting than any trauma from the past. The story had begun with a photograph on a wall, but had ended with something much more beautiful: a family reunited by the eternal love of a mother who had never stopped watching over them. I hope you enjoyed the story. Today I have some news. If you like my narrations, I'm sure you'll also love my new prayer channel, Prayers with Alex. Come with me to praise God with prayers full of faith every morning and every night. The link is up here in the card and also in the pinned comment. I hope to see you there. I'd also love to know what you thought of this story. Tell me in the comments, and now on the screen, another exciting video is appearing that will surely surprise you. Tap to keep being moved by stories that touch the soul. I'll see you there.